Welcome back to Mystic Fix on 1019 and 94.1 News Talk STL. We just heard a moving conversation about life and death from my friend in hospice, Suze Mondello. And now changing gears for a moment, we're going to be talking to author Peter Bebergal about communicating with the dead through technology. Welcome, Peter Bebergal. You've got a fascinating history and are author of a couple of books that are exactly right for our program, Mystic Fix. In 2015, you wrote Season of the Witch, How the Occult Saved Rock and Roll. Boy, I could do a whole show on that one alone. But I might be just a little bit more interested today in Strange Frequencies, the extraordinary story of the technological quest for the supernatural. Peter, you have studied at Harvard Divinity School, and you write with an emphasis on speculative and the slightly fringe kind of stuff here. So I thought maybe you could talk especially about Strange Frequencies, but really about both books.
Well, I'm very interested in what I like to call the occult imagination. And for me, it's important to make a distinction. And when I use the word imagination, I don't mean making things up imagination. I mean really the foundation of the way in which all of human culture and thought arises from some interaction with some unknown idea that then we codify or we turn into art or music. What I'm not interested in, which I've been maybe criticized a little bit for by certain contingents, is I'm not interested in the truth or falsity of, say, occult or supernatural experiences. So I'm not interested in trying to prove anything, but I'm also not trying to debunk anything. What I'm just really interested in is how human beings and human culture have interacted with some phenomena.
Mm-hmm.
Or
you're an anthropologist of
yeah, but
sorts.
I would say that I still have a personal urgency in the sense of feeling that there's something of great value to our own consciousness in exploring these ideas. So maybe a little bit more of a journalist than an anthropologist insofar as I want to be on the ground. You know, in anthropology is an interesting comparison because there's always that question of how far should the anthropologist insert themselves into the lives of the people that they're studying. Where for me, it's essential that I insert myself into those experiences.
Okay. So you've actually participated in some of these, like in Strange Frequencies, you know, you talk about the use of technology to find immortality and these ghostly gadgets, and you've done some of this stuff yourself?
That's right. So I've built some of these radios that are intended to try to pick up spirits along the frequencies, the FM frequencies. I spent some time with the photographer Shannon Taggart, who was a spirit photographer of sorts, and went to seances with her to watch her as she attempted to take photographs of, say, ectoplasm. And so certainly, yes, I feel like it's important not necessarily to try to share in the experiences of believers or people who are having them, but to really try to understand it from being on the ground. I mean, Season of the Witch is an example because it's a book about rock and roll and the occult, but I love rock and roll. And
Yeah.
I was a kid who grew up really interested in trying to unpack the secret messages or symbols from the lyrics or the album covers.
Sure,
And so
as was I.
exactly. So I am sympathetic with that feeling, that excitement of what the music, for example, can do for us in terms of opening up or opening up that side of our consciousness, which allows for the moment for these things to be real.
Getting back to strange frequencies for a moment, were you afraid at any time? Did any of these things convince you in any way that something was actually happening?
I'm not sure afraid is the right word. Maybe enchanted is a better word.
Okay.
I prefer that. I think that I'm open to what I call enchanted experiences. I've participated in certain religious rituals outside of, say, my own, personal faith life, and I've been able to be enchanted by those experiences and feel the presence, say,
Uh-huh.
of the numinal, or the spirit,
Sure.
the divine. But it doesn't require me to then convert or become now fully invested in something. It's about being able to share, I think, in a more human experience that we all can share, but maybe it just gets expressed in different ways.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. See,
Eh,
do you think everyone has these spiritual experiences on some level?
I
Maybe I should ask, were you opened to something new through your scholarship?
Absolutely, and I didn't always get it. I attempted, using those radios as an example to try to engage with the spirit world, as it were, using those. And I didn't quite get what I was looking for there, or what
Uh-huh.
I was hoping for. And I think what's interesting about that is, even though I didn't go into it necessarily believing or even disbelieving, I just went into it trying to be as neutral as I could. There was certainly a part of me that was excited about the idea of something actually happening, right?
Sure. Sure.
And
Yeah.
so when it doesn't, you still are a little bit disappointed.
Uh-huh. Yeah. I've got a friend on Twitter who's always walking through graveyards with some sort of machine, and he's picking up messages and he puts it on Twitter all the time. And I listen and I think, well, maybe it's saying
Right,
that, you know.
exactly. That's right. But what it's also interesting is what I found was, as I was doing those experiments, though, even more interesting than whether or not something actually happened was how I could sense that my own consciousness had changed, that I had entered into a particular state where there was possibility. And that's really exciting for me, because it's kind of a state of it's a liminal state. It's an ambiguous state. It's just
Mm-hmm.
full of possibility. And that itself is its own kind of enchantment, where you're just open to something
Yeah.
that is otherworldly or beyond our normal sense experience. And I think if if we can, I think we could do more of that without having to worry about forcing ourselves then into a box of believer, or if it doesn't happen, a box of skeptic.
Yeah.
That, it's just sort of being open, and yeah, challenging ourselves to be sometimes a little less reasonable all the time.
Interesting. Sure. In addition to photographing ghosts, which you mentioned, you talk about the legend of the golem and history of automata, if I'm saying that right.
Yeah, golem.
Um,
Yep.
yeah, and can you address that a little bit? Like, what is a golem in today's world?
Well,
We all know of Frankenstein, and
yes, that's right. I mean, the idea of the golem is, this artificial being that is supposed to be imbued with some divine spirit, but is not fully human.
Mhm.
There's an interesting rabbinical story of a rabbi who makes a golem, brings it to his companions, and they say, "Well, this is an interesting sort of a toy, but it doesn't speak, and the fact that it doesn't speak means it doesn't have the quality of what we would consider human." And that notion of speaking is very important, of course, because Adam, the first human, as it were, names the animals by speaking.
Yeah.
So there's a sense that language is that key. I think we're all
Although a
struggling.
mute person might be really upset by that statement.
Exactly. Although they could communicate in other ways, right?
Yeah.
Language is
Okay, gotcha.
Yep, writing, right, is still. So I think that poses an interesting problem for us when we think about something like the new artificial intelligence, things like ChatGPT and things, and how much is language or being able to communicate ideas an indication or a measure of what it means to be human.
Hmm.
And so there's the so the idea of the golem becomes an interesting tool because, or an interesting example, because the rabbi is trying to, in some ways, imitate God in the form of creating something that is living, but the fact that it has those limitations is is a way of saying that we can't do that. We
Ah,
can't act like God. We can only take that so far. So when you
yeah.
have something like artificial intelligence, does that kind of start to change some of the spiritual
Right.
equation there? I would say personally, no. I think maybe even calling these things artificial intelligence is a little bit of a misnomer because it's still just a lot of really fancy algorithms and data
Sure.
processing, right?
Sure. We've all played with Chat GPT by now. It gets a lot of things wrong. I mean, I can put in some parameters and it'll completely misunderstand what I'm talking about. And
Exactly.
yeah.
Right. That's right. But I do think that the golem represents an early example of where the industrious or creative spirit of human endeavors to build, to create, to think about how we could use tools to somehow build a bridge between us and the divine or the otherworldly is a very early example of that. And it just sort of continued on into the sense of even, yes, creating things like these clockwork mechanisms like an automaton, which for many years or for a long period of time, people were confused about whether or not they might actually have a soul. And if they did have some kind of soul, maybe it was demonic because only God can really imbue something with a true creative spirit. So there's
Right.
a funny story of an automaton that could play the flute. The story might be apocryphal. This is in the 1700s, that the French Inquisition was so worried about this device, it was just a clockwork mechanism which could play the flute, that they put it on trial
Oh,
to see if to try to get it to reveal that it was some satanic or demonic force inside
oh,
because of
how interesting.
that notion again of what is often referred to as the uncanny valley, which is
Yeah.
this sense of something that feels like it has some attributes of the human, but something about it is off just enough that it makes us feel a little bit uncomfortable or a little bit chilled. And
Yeah.
so we want
Well,
to interrogate it in that way to see what is it really.
and I think getting back to Chat GPI, everybody who is of our generation, who grew up in 60s, 70s, has the baggage, the framework of 2001 A Space Odyssey, right, with Hal at the computer.
That's right, exactly.
And we've all grown up with that as part of our culture. And so it just feels closer and closer to Hal. And so I think that spooks some of us.
That's right.
What about the voicemails from the dead? That was a new one that I read. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so this woman, Donna Hogan, she's a lovely woman who is one of the preeminent sort of investigators of what we call electronic voice phenomena, which is again part of this idea of trying to listen or communicate with spirits over electronic audio devices of some kind. And her story was that her brother-in-law was sadly killed in a car accident, and she was spending many days with her sister and supporting her in the family. And when she came home, there was a voicemail left days after he had passed away. It sounded as if it was from him trying to
Hmm.
communicate with her. And that was her first experience with electronic voice phenomena. And at the time, she had contacted the phone company to see if there was a glitch in when it said the time stamp was for the
Yeah.
recording, but they said that that is impossible, that the time stamp was correct. And it set
And
her off on this journey of
what
both
did he
being,
say?
I don't quite recall, I'd have to look, but just you're sort of calling her name, and
Uh-huh.
then it got sort of another line came in and got it mixed up. It was like a normal voicemail had come in, and the spirit had used that as kind of a method or a channel through which to communicate. There's this really interesting idea that Donna has, which is that if you think about a spirit of the dead, they are what she calls a disembodied consciousness. So they don't have vocal cords, they don't have
Uh-huh.
mouths with which to form words. So they rely on technology to be able to kind of manipulate radio waves or say a voicemail message or other electronic devices.
Lights flashing, things like that.
Yeah, but specifically
Yeah.
in the world of audio, right?
Uh-huh.
To be able to manipulate something like a voicemail message to be able to communicate with us.
Oh, so fun. Well, I think the heart of both the books, Season of the Witch and Strange Frequencies, is that there's a lot more under our culture that is occult based than we ever guessed.
Yes, that's
that
right.
has formed our society. um God, I really do want to have a show just on the music thing, but I know you have talked about how Elvis was inspired by hoodoo. Everyone, of course, knows the mysticism around George Harrison, the occult background in Led Zeppelin. I was surprised to read that there's Masonic imagery and hip hop that you've
Oh,
identified.
yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So it's really a key ingredient behind so much music. It
Yes.
makes me think that some of the crazy fundamentalists who have persecuted rock and roll might not have been entirely wrong.
No, absolutely not. I mean, certainly those things are there. What I don't think is that there's a vast satanic conspiracy to
Uh-huh.
infect the
Right.
minds of our children, right? It's,
Right.
young um, musicians who feel in many ways connected to ideas that are outside of the mainstream, spiritual ideas that are outside of the mainstream, because their own art and music is something that is pushing up against the boundaries of what we might consider normative ways of doing things. And so it's all of a piece, it's all of a way of understanding yourself and your music and your art.
Yeah.
This kind
Yeah.
of a spiritual rebellion makes sense for a rock and roll rebel in terms of
Sure.
thinking about how they want to understand their own spiritual life. And so occult ideas, which for all intent and purposes over throughout history have been considered either heretical or outside of mainstream religious traditions. Of course, those are going to be the ideas and images that and symbols that will sort of feel personal and resonate for you
Yeah.
if the music and the art that you're making is something like that. And so I think some musicians and bands have maybe used it in kind of a cynical way, just throw the upside down pentagram on the album cover because it looks cool. Or you have somebody like David Bowie who was really, I think, deeply personally interested in how his music itself was a form of magic and could
Yeah.
transform culture and transform himself into these different personalities, into these different
Right.
characters. And so, is definitely a large playing field for how these ideas and symbols can be used by
Yeah.
musicians and artists.
Well, gosh, I think if anything, your work shows that just by being in our culture, everyone has a level of spirituality, even if they're not entirely conscious of it, that there's this stuff all around us
That's
that's
right.
affecting
Yes,
us.
that's
Yeah.
right. I
Yeah.
mean, we're really talking about the religious imagination at the highest level, and the occult imagination is really just a subset of that. It's not really that different. It's not
Sure.
opposed to it. It's a part of it.
Sure. Well, Peter Bebergal, I'm so happy to have you. Your books can be found on Amazon and I'm sure other places. How could someone reach you if they wanted to connect?
They can find me on Instagram, and I think you can even find other email contacts for me in any of those profiles if somebody wants to contact me directly.
Fantastic. Well, thank you for talking to Mystic Fix, and hope to
Absolutely.
talk to you
Thanks.
again.
Really great to be here and to talk to you. Thanks, Julie.
Take care. If you'd like to be one of our free tarot card readings in the third segment, you can register for our giveaway on mysticfix.com. Coming up, more free tarot card readings. You're listening to Mystic Fix on News Talk STL 1019 and 94.1.